www.org, on the World Wide Web. Billy Carter, A Journey Through the Shadows, is a biography of former President Jimmy Carter's brother, William. It's written by William Carter's son, who goes by the nickname Buddy. In this book, Buddy Carter tells of his father's struggle with public scrutiny, alcoholism, and cancer. He read excerpts from the Southern Festival of Books in Nashville for about 45 minutes.
My name is Tom T. Hall, and I am a host, and my job is to introduce the author of the hour, of the moment. And I think I'm well qualified for this introduction for a lot of reasons. One of them being that I've been in public life for some 40 years, and I've introduced a lot of people in that time, a lot of famous people, some authors among them, if I may drop some names: Kurt Vonnegut and Alex Haley and Dolly Parton, George Jones, and even President of the United States and some senators and remarkably famous people. In introducing those people I've just mentioned, it was not much of a chore, because as they say, they always turn and say, this person needs no introduction. I've always said, well, let them introduce themselves. But this young man that I'm about to introduce needs an introduction. This is his second book, and it's a remarkable book, and the book itself he will introduce to you in time today. But I am a close friend of this young man. He has many friends, and I am honored and pleased to number myself among them. As writing goes, when you see a book written about Billy Carter by his son, it might strike some as an opportunity, but it's not. This book is written, I know, because I was there at the outset of the notion of writing this book. This book is an obligation. If one, in the course of his life, decides to write, there are some things that he or she must write. And when the idea of this book was proposed to the author by the publisher, the author came to me and said, do you think I should write this book? Or, because questions do present themselves. This is a man writing a book about his father. And a man of some consequence and some legend and some notoriety and some infamy, in fact. And so this was a hard decision, I'm certain, to write this book. And then, as I began to read the pages and they were shared with me, a notion that I had entertained for a long time was made manifest in the fact that this young man is a remarkable writer. I had thought that when he wrote his first novel, and I had read some of his essays and short stories, and I shared some of the manuscript with a friend of mine whom many of you know, John Siegenthaler. And I sent him a few pages, and I told him, I said, I think you should read this because I believe this young man has the gift. And I know from personal experience what this gift is. I think I'm also qualified to know what good writing is. I've done a lot of reading. And I have made a living these many years by my wit, putting clever little lyrics to clever little songs, and on occasion writing short stories and novels, and a very successful book on how to write songs. And so I am pleased today for many reasons, some of them personal, many of them private, but to introduce you to the author and to a wonderful, wonderful book. I hope that you will find this book and go into it without any reservations, if you love to read good stories, well told, about important events in the history of this remarkable country and this remarkable world, I hope that you will go into this book without any preconceived notions of it at all and just enjoy it as I did, even though I was very, very close to it at the outset. And having said that, I am pleased to introduce to you, ladies and gentlemen, the author, Buddy Carter.
Thanks, Tom. I'd also like to thank the Tennessee Humanities Council for having me here today and giving me a chance to talk about my book a little bit. Billy Carter, A Journey Through the Shadows, is a book about my dad. It's my second book, both of which were published by Longstreet Press out of Atlanta. The book probably wouldn't have been written, either one of them, if not for the love of reading that was given to me by my mother and my father. We all read. Everybody in my family read. My sisters, my brothers. Seemed like we read constantly, sometimes to the point of excluding everything else in the world, sometimes to the point of rudeness a little bit, I would guess. There's a little bit about this here. The door from the den led to the kitchen. To the right was the dining area. Anyone coming into our home during meal times would, of course, be invited to the table and given a heaped plate. But conversation was out of the question because all of us, my folks, my sisters, and I, read during meals. Our faces were obscured by paperbacks, and the clink of stainless steel and china would be accompanied by the whisk of pages being turned. Definitely not a Norman Rockwell setting and something we never carried into other people's homes. I, at least, have continued this guilty pleasure because it is almost impossible for me to enjoy a meal now without the help of Stephen King or James Lee Burke. So almost from the beginning, I wanted to be a writer, but I wanted to write fiction. That's all I wanted to do was write fiction. And after my first book, The Search for Saving Sam, was published, I found out people wanted to know about my family, and I was asked time and again, why haven't you written something about your dad, about your family? Well, I didn't want to. That's why I had never written anything about him. But I realized that if I wanted to be a serious writer of fiction, I had to get this out of the way. I had to write this story about my family so I could tell people I'd done it. So I looked at it as kind of a chore in the beginning, but then I realized as I began to write the book how lucky I'd been to be part of this story and what a wonderful character my father was, because he was nothing if bigger than life. And every time any of us get together, friends or family or even people we don't really even know, we start telling Billy stories. We do that even today, 10 years after he died, and we were doing it on the day he was buried. We just couldn't help it. I was laughing when the hearse backed into Mama's driveway. I was laughing, and so were the 3 or 4 men standing with me beneath the carport. We were all dressed up in dark blue suits and ties and good solid Sunday shoes. I remember wiping sweat from my forehead with the sleeve of my suit coat because it was mid-September in South Georgia. Fine fall weather for most other parts of the country, but still hotter than hell in Plains. But the heat didn't really bother me or the men I was standing with. We'd grown up with it, lived with it all of our lives, and the laughter kept our minds from the gnats and the humidity and the reason we were clustered together under the carport. I don't remember the particular story we were laughing about, and it didn't really matter. There were so many myths and legends, and so help me God, right hand for Jesus, he really did this story. It's about my old man. I truly believe we could have stood in that one spot for 3 days remembering and remembering and still had a few more to tell. I found out pretty quickly, too, that I really could still be standing there listening to stories about my dad. So I originally set out to gather these stories. I wanted to talk to everybody I knew or who knew my father and have them tell me Billy's stories. But one thing I found out immediately is that I am not a historian. I'm not a biographer. But what I am, is my father's son, which I thought put me in a pretty unique position to write a story about him, write a book about him. I found out, too, that I couldn't write about my father without writing about Plains, the town we all grew up in. And it's like everyone's hometown, I guess. I like to look at Plains as having a little bit of magic. I think we all do when we're talking about the place we were born and raised in. Plains is no exception. The Plains I grew up in, the one not yet tainted by tourists or looked upon by the eyes of the world, is not there anymore. Maybe it never really was, because the Plains I grew up in, I admit, has become almost mythical for me, a place I can never have back. For a few years at least, the years I like to think of as the ones that made me who I am, I lived in the best place in the world. When I was a child, this town of 750 souls supported 2 grocery stores, a drugstore, a mercantile, 2 gas stations, a barbershop, a bank, and a honky-tonk or 2, and of course several churches. Main Street Plains has always reminded me of a movie set. The storefronts are 2-story brick with wide plate glass windows and heavy wood frame doors. The sidewalks are shaded from the sun with a tin awning supported by a wooden post. The stores are deeper than they are wide and floored with hardwood or heavy ceramic tile. Every day there were people on the sidewalks, moving in and out of the stores, conducting business, and Saturday nights were almost carnival-like. Tractors were as common as cars on the streets, and depending on the season, big metal or wooden wagons filled with peanuts or corn or cotton rumbled up and down 280 or Highway 45 to turn into one of the 2 warehouse businesses in town. Plains Cotton Warehouse, owned by the Williams family, or Carter's Warehouse, belonging to my family. Sometimes the air would be filled, like snow, with tiny bits of cotton from the gin, and on August and September nights, after the sounds of the town had died, the faint roar of peanut dryers lulled you to sleep. In the middle of town stood the water tower, a huge silver War of the Worlds Martian flecked with rust. My sister Jana and I once tried to fly from its side from a few rungs up on wings made of newspaper. And I am told my father and my uncle once fist fought beneath the tower in full view of the town, shaming my grandmother. A few steps from the tower, back across 280, was Mr. Mills' gas station, the one my father later bought in 1972. By day, Mr. Mills was your standard full-service filling station, and you could see him darting about in his tan work uniform, his hair shockingly white, pumping gas, checking oil, and fixing tires. When the evening came, though, the old wooden theater seats along one outside wall of the station filled with men doing men things, and, it was rumored, drinking beer. Plains is a postcard come to life. It is hard for me not to have a soft spot in my heart for a place where there is real interest each summer in who is going to claim bragging rights for producing the first ripened tomato from their garden. A place where Halloween is celebrated each year at the Lions Club Carnival, where old men in aprons and paper hats ladle Brunswick stew and barbecue and serve cornbread to a third of the population, while children, dressed in homemade costumes, bob for apples as they kneel around number 2 washtubs. And then there's a garden club and the Stitch and Chat, where ladies gather each month to stitch and chat. And there is no escaping the impact of the churches. The week is planned around plays or revivals or potluck suppers. My mother spends a good part of each Saturday gleaning local gardens for flowers to grace the altar at Plains Maranatha Baptist Church. And I imagine children still give nickels and dimes each week in Sunday school, sealed in little paper envelopes as offerings for the Lottie Moon missionaries. Vacation Bible School is a grand production, and each choir accepts with good grace the 1 or 2 members who sing off-key in praise of the Lord. Hours are spent on front porches, fanning gnats from faces and slow rocking while winding down from the day. And if you listen hard enough from the porch, you can maybe hear from 2 blocks away the tinkle of ice as your neighbor has one last glass of sweet tea before slipping through the screen door to retire for the night. Just imagine that. One thing led to another when I started writing about my father. Of course, I had to write about Plains, and then in writing about Plains, I couldn't very well not write about a lot of the people who lived there, mostly the farmers. We were in the agricultural business, and my father was a farmer at heart, first and foremost. That's what we grew up. We grew up around that. That's what the town survived on, was the agricultural business. My family was in the agricultural business. We bought crops from farmers and sold them to various processors. The farmers, in turn, bought seed, fertilizer, pesticides, and herbicides from us. We depended on the farmers as much as the farmers depended on the weather. Bad times for the farmers meant bad times for Plains. When planting or harvesting times came around, it was not unusual for my old man to leave the house at 4:30 in the morning, no later than 5, to begin his rounds. He met farmers in the field, if only for a word or two. Others waved in passing. Some told him what would be needed later in the day or week as far as chemicals or supplies were concerned. Most of these men barely had time to eat during peak season, much less the time to place orders over the phone. He rode again late in the afternoon and sometimes at night, checking on the farmers in the fields. It's not something that was demanded of him. He loved it, and I think he felt it only right that he lend some kind of support to those who fed the rest of us. Farming is not for those who expect a cheering section. If there were happier times for my father, I don't know when they were. He took his responsibilities very seriously. He shined there. There is no way I can count the times I sat in the office of the warehouse watching the old man interact with the farmers. It was a show, to be sure. There were some men who we waited for to come walking through the door. The verbal exchanges between some of these men and my father were fast and furious and wicked and funny. There were stabs and punches and solid knockouts. And I know for a fact some of those men came by with no business to attend to. They came to try and take on the old man, to spar with him. Others came to watch. But he was a master, and very few ever got the best of him. I almost felt sorry for some of those with the national press who came to Plains in the late 70s with Mayberry on their minds, intending to put the backwoods brother in his place. Almost. The old man was quick and as sharp as anyone I've ever seen. Even as a child, I was amazed. But even in my amazement, I wondered why that wit was never shown at home. He somehow switched it off when he walked into the house. The humor was needed at work because harvest begins about the time a damp blanket of heat is pulled up over the lower extremities of Georgia and the gnats swarm so thick you can't open your mouth without gulping down a pound or two of unwanted protein. And the work is hard. So the old man joked and played around with most of the farmers and the hands, kept things light while keeping his mind on the business. He treated all the farmers with respect, a respect they'd all earned, the respect they deserved. But there were others he treated differently. Some he showed a great respect. There are people in any business who seem to be above all others. It's the same with farming. I know men and women who have given their lives to it. They are what farming is all about, and it is not hard to spot them. They are the ones who walk this world as if they themselves are the land embodied. Quiet people mostly who breathe when the earth breathes. People who have in one hand more strength than most of us will ever know. People who can smell rain a day or two away and who know the exact moment when a year has gone from good to bad, even when the crops stand healthy before them. There are very few of these people left now, but I always knew when one came into the office by the change in my father. Then, of course, one thing I had to write about when I wrote about my father was the infamous gas station in Plains, which was pretty much just a honky-tonk and a beer joint that just happened to have a gas pump out front. But sold a little gas on the side. But that's where he spent his off time. When he wasn't farming and he wasn't at home, he was at the station. Before 1975, those who traveled Highway 280 and passed the station saw nothing more than a squat white building with fly-specked windows fronted by 2 gas pumps and a lighted Amoco sign. There was no way it could be called friendly looking, and I imagine there were some, down to a damn near empty tank, who slowed, got an eyeful, heard the faint beginnings of the banjo tune from the movie Deliverance welling up around them, then decided to chance a 10 miles to America's, where they could gas up under a well-lit awning and maybe buy a Twinkie or two. The place wasn't particularly threatening, but it did possess an air of seediness. More often than not, Randy, the black lab, who belonged to Mr. Norman Murray, lay sprawled out in front, barely able to move, waiting for someone to toss him another honey bun. There was always a litter of cigarette butts and beer tabs and peanut shells at the foot of the old wooden seats against the front wall of the building. The seats, years before, had been rescued from the Plains High School auditorium during a period of renovation. 4 or 5 wooden Coke crates were there, too, perfect for propping feet or sitting on when the seats were full. The seats were backed by a big mullion window that was obscured by stickers and posters and beer signs. Above the window was a big square RC cola clock that hadn't worked for years. There was a Lance cracker machine and a Coke machine outside for those who didn't want to brave the interior. A metal awning attached to the roof covered a concrete pad that ran from the front door to the pump island. The concrete was stained with years and years of oil, and a black rubber hose snaked across the pad. It was attached to a bell that clanged obnoxiously every time a car rolled over the hose. To the left of the main building was a small tin shack where we kept all the tools. In front of the shack was a rack or lift that was operated by an air compressor and was so old we'd prop it up with metal pipes. It was either that or risk an LTD crashing down on our heads in the middle of an oil change. The concrete floor of the shack was 2 inches thick with decades of grease and dirt, and if a metal tool was dropped, it hit with a muted thud. In between the two buildings was an open aisle of sorts, about 12 feet wide. There was a rack of tires there, and the back part, where the tire changing machine was roofed. The machine, an amazing contraption by plane standards, reminds me of its existence every day by the scars on my knuckles. There were always at least 2 grills in that open area made from 55-gallon drums cut lengthwise in half and hinged. The insides of the grills were pretty crusty. We counted on the next fire to sterilize and burn away the remnants of the last cookout. Behind the station was a big pecan tree where we parked. Beneath the tree was a big wooden wire spool where we sometimes sat and drank beer. There was an open oil ditch that ran from the back of the tool shack to the vacant lot behind it. This was before the EPA came to Plains. Inside, the station was part convenience store and part clubhouse, and there was definitely the air of an honky-tonk about the place. The floor was worn tile with big patches of bare concrete showing through in places. To the left, through the door, was a wall covered with calendars and posters and advertisements. Phone numbers and names and semi-crude messages were scribbled on the bare sheetrock. A big plastic steer's head from God knows where was mounted above it all. To the right was the bar, a big wooden L-shaped thing with a formica top. A small section of the short end of the L flipped up on hinges. Beneath the bar, there were three big coolers. One, a red Coca-Cola chest with embossed white letters on front. All were filled with the coldest beer in Sumter County. Behind the bar was a wall of shelves stocked with all the necessities, blue cans of potted meat and Vienna sausage, flat cans of sardines, dime packs of crackers, cards of pocket combs and radiator stop leak, potato chips and cheap oil, everything. The cash register was behind the bar, and so was the phone. When it rang, whoever was closest picked it up and said, "Station." That's all that was needed. Sometimes it was one of the older widowed ladies in town needing their car jumped off. This was not unusual. Some of these ladies drove cars 25 years old or more and terrified us all on the rare occasions when they took them out. If the phone rang after 5 in the afternoon, very often frantic gestures at the bar indicated who was not there. The men became invisible. I've personally lied to many of the wives in town at one time or another. The station could have been anywhere, I suppose. Any building, any lot, or maybe nothing more than an open space surrounded by trees in a forest somewhere. The place didn't really matter. The station was more attitude than location anyway. I'm sure the walls of the physical building, that squat white ramshackle pile of wood, were soaked with the residue of the past when Mr. Mill owned the place. More ghost. But then again, it was all attitude back then, too. No, the station was more a place in time than anything else. And there are some, I guess, who would think I make more of that time than there really was. But that's okay. They weren't there. For me, it was a time when all the right people, all the right bits and pieces of what makes a damn near magical place magical came together. Plains was still thriving then, on its own, without the tourist and the press. The town wasn't a backdrop. It was a real place with real people. None of us were actors then or extras. It was a time right before discount stores and microwave ovens or cable TV. We were all still dusty and sweaty and country as hell. We were comfortable with where we were and who we were and didn't know we were soon to be considered cute and quaint, almost backwards, in the eyes of those from bigger places. And we wouldn't have cared even if we had known. And the station was definitely my father's place, his place, a place that got its life from him and reflected the way he looked at the world. Yeah, it was a dirty little place, and at any given time you could walk in and find a drunk or two sitting around bitching about farm prices or wondering if the goddamn Braves are ever going to make the playoffs. But that was okay, because if you were there, you somehow automatically belonged. We laughed a lot there, a whole lot, and nobody went hungry if they could only wait around a while. If money was tight and you needed a tank of gas and a six-pack or two to take you to Friday, that was no problem. The old man would hold the ticket for a while or not deposit your check until you asked him to. And there was always a dog hanging around somewhere. an absolutely positive sign that there was at least one good thing to be said about the people who frequented the place. I don't really know if the old man ever made any money from the station, and I don't think he cared. What mattered was that he had a place to go, a place he was accepted as Billy Carter before he became Billy Carter. And yeah, the beer was cold. That's another thing about my dad that I knew I had to write about. I couldn't escape writing about it. My father was an alcoholic. Sometimes I tend to think that his brother becoming elected president kind of accelerated that. I know now it didn't. He was always an alcoholic. He had been forever. But that seems to be one of the things the press picked up on and hung on to through the years, in spite of the good things about him. But it's one thing I can't deny. No one in my family can deny. My mother was in a constant state of disquiet. It was not easy being Billy Carter's wife. She was the buffer between him and the rest of the world, for the world's sake as well as his own. A million excuses for him passed her lips. A million apologies were made. And she readily admits that for years she was his enabler. Some alcoholics seem to possess great and mysterious powers, powers that allow them over a period of time to pull those closest to them into the hole they've dug for themselves. I wonder sometimes how hard it was for my mother to smile when that was the last thing she wanted to do. I wonder how many times she assured my sisters and me everything was all right when it really wasn't. Many times she held her head up and walked through a crowd as others whispered when she passed. A lot, I bet. She had no choice. Those strange and mysterious powers my father had over her and the rest of us would allow no different. To some, I suppose, it is unimaginable that one person could have such control. And I've seen the looks in the eyes of those who have not experienced life with an alcoholic family member when I try to explain what it was like. There's a flicker behind those eyes, sometimes that conveys a mild disgust that someone could be so weak of will as to allow alcohol to take over their lives. And many times I have sensed an unspoken question as to why we put up with it. It's very simple, really. We loved him, just as we would have loved him if he'd had the misfortune to be stricken with any other horrible disease. But alcoholism does not begin as a physical affliction. There are no outward signs to warn others away. It is something that begins in a person's soul, growing slowly to eventually wrap them and the ones closest to them in a foggy, bear-like hug. I would never pretend to think I could get into my father's head and know what was going on in there. Some have tried, and it is laughable. I do know his alcoholism took over damn near most of his waking hours. When he wasn't drinking, he was thinking about when and where his next drink was coming from. This is something he admitted to. The number one thing with an alcoholic is to feed the habit. That's all that matters. But even with that horrible thing pecking at his brain, he had a form of self-discipline that was amazing. As I've said before, he never drank at work. And until the year before he was mentally and physically consumed by the disease, he never drank at home. A minor feat, I suppose, to those who don't understand, but impressive as hell to those of us who do. Now would be the place, I guess, to write about the times we were embarrassed or hurt by the things he did. The times before the press came along and we went public, and he went public and the whole country knew he had a problem. But I won't. Those times belong to my family and me. They are ours, they are his, and it is enough for me to know that in spite of those times, he loved us, more than enough. It is tough growing up in the shadow of someone, tougher still when it is the shadow of someone you love. It would be easy to excuse my old man for his drinking and the problems it caused by saying he was overwhelmed by whatever imagined pressures he faced in trying to live up to an ideal set down by his family. But he knew what he was doing, and he never made excuses. He never apologized, and I won't do it for him. Besides the things going on with my father, there were other things going on in the town in the late 70s and the mid-70s when Jimmy was elected president. My uncle was nominated and then elected. That little small town I read about earlier, Plains, became unrecognizable, as did a lot of the people in the town. But it did change. While we were waiting for the inauguration, Plains was changing right before our eyes. Main Street was transformed into a combination of the Strip at Panama City Beach, Florida, and Victory Drive in Columbus, Georgia. Or so it seemed to me. I sure as hell never expected to see a souvenir shop in town. But within days of the election, there were several. A quick trip down the sidewalk in front of our postcard perfect business district, along with a pocket full of cash, could get you all the cheap plastic foreign-made things you could ever care to own. There were Jimmy T-shirts, Jimmy caps, Jimmy buttons, and Jimmy bumper stickers. If you needed Jimmy mugs and Jimmy keychains or maybe a plastic Jimmy bottle opener made in the shape of his head with giant teeth sticking out, they were all easily found. There were 8 by 10 glossy color photographs of Jimmy and plates with his painted profile, Jimmy towels, Jimmy ties, and Jimmy socks. Of course, you had your Jimmy jewelry and your Jimmy pencils, pens, and pads. Jimmy coloring books were popular, as well as Jimmy snow globes that featured a little tiny plastic Jimmy standing beside an even tinier plastic peanut. And then there was the tacky stuff. The things manufactured by people who I'm sure have their own very special place reserved in hell. I won't list them all, they are too numerous, but my favorites, those being the most hideous, were the little blue boxes labeled hillbilly toilet paper. They contained a corn cob and electric hillbilly toilet paper, a corn cob with an electrical cord attached to one end. Hungry? Main Street Plains had peanuts, raw, roasted, boiled, brittled, fried, pied, and liquefied. If you didn't want to eat them, you could buy kits to grow them yourself or buy a book to read about them. There were peanut pins for your lapel and cartoon peanuts with teeth painted on them. You could spend your money on peanut wreaths or peanuts adorned with pipe cleaners and little plastic googly eyes. And mixed in with all the Jimmy, Plains, and peanut memorabilia were the brightly colored plastic things found in every cheesy souvenir shop in the country, from curly plastic straws to cheap sunglasses. This all had a great effect on my father. Of course, coupled with the alcohol and the attention he was getting about this time, in the late 80s, of course, my father decided he should start getting some business dealings with the Libyans, which turned out to be a big mistake. And my father really loved Plains. You have to understand how much he loved this town and how much it hurt him to see it change the way it did. I mean, lifelong friendships were torn apart because of the things happening in town. Most of it was based on money, but it did have a big effect other than the alcohol on my father. I don't have many things to remind me of my old man during the mid to late 70s. There's an empty Billy beer can on the shelf above me. Beside it is a Coke can commemorating the 1991 Braves for being the National League champs, finally. I think I would trade the one with my father's name on it before I would part with the can lauding the Braves. The few pictures I have of him when he was Billy Carter are hidden away in an old walnut box. Years pass between the times the light of day falls on them. The one I do keep visible is an 8 by 10 black and white of what used to be a typical day at the station. There are no strangers out front, only the old man and me and a few of the regulars. The building itself wears its shabbiness and the crooked signs and the oil spots on the concrete pad like a comfortable old coat. And there's a straw broom propped against a drink machine. It's as if all the bullshit that had been piled upon the town was somehow swept away for a brief moment and the old Plains beneath it was revealed. I know it was taken by a man who had no reason to be there other than that Jimmy and Plains were in the news, but that's all right. I can't see him. The one other item I keep out in the open is a box containing a plastic model issued by Revell. I've never attempted to put it together, so it is still in pieces. It's not the model itself I keep around, but rather the box. It makes me laugh. Billy Carter's redneck power pickup, the box proclaims. Below that is a picture of my old man grinning through the window of a chromed up and decaled white Chevy pickup with wooden bed rails. The look on his face is one of a person who is curiously unattached to what is going on in the moment. A look to me, at least, of resignation. And there is a glow of the drinker about him, a glow we had all become increasingly familiar with by the time that picture was taken. But I don't dwell on the photo. I don't find it funny and my eyes slide over the face. What makes me laugh is a description on the side of the box. A one-of-a-kind pickup for a one-of-a-kind guy, the box says. Whether he's on service runs or just running around town, he does it in style with his redneck power pickup. And it goes on about what a good old boy redneck my father was. The truck was real, lent to my father by Revell as a promotional deal. I don't know where it is now, but I'm glad it's gone. What's funny to me about all of this is how quickly he was labeled with the image and how easily everyone gobbled it up. I don't think my old man ever made a service run. He barely knew one end of a screwdriver from the other. And the redneck thing began as a joke played on the press. They didn't know where else to put him, and the joke grew and grew and grew until it became much bigger than the real Billy Carter. So I guess the reason my home is not a museum to that time, why my walls are not covered with pictures and clippings and T-shirts and such, is because I know none of it was true. Oh, it all happened, and my old man, by choice, participated, making the appearances and giving the interviews and basically selling himself from one end of the country to the other. But for me to remember those years as somehow being his glory days does a great disservice to my father. It gives more power to those 3 or 4 years when he seemed to stumble around, sometimes in desperation, than they deserve. I know most pictures taken of him in those few years show only the animated shell of the man, a man who was once 1,000 times more alive. Another thing that really drained my father, took a lot away from him, was the Libyan deal and the IRS investigation and the FBI investigation and everybody in the world who was investigating my father. But this was 3 years of pure hell on the family. We would wake up in the mornings to find 7 unmarked government cars on the street in front of our home. And when my father left the house, he had his own motorcade of people supposed to be following him. Our phones were tapped. Needless to say, it was a big drain on the family. The Libya thing, what the hell was that all about? Well, I don't really know. I don't feel too bad about it either, because the United States government spent close to $30 million in 1970s dollars trying to figure it out, and even they couldn't come up with an answer to satisfy anyone. The whole thing kind of faded away after the 1980 election, but while it was going on, the only true way it could be described was as a nightmare. And oh my God, what has the old man gotten himself into now nightmare? Of course, I, just like everyone else in the family, wasn't privy to all the information concerning my dad's Libyan deal. As with everything else going on in his life, this too he kept mostly to himself. I do know the whole thing began while the old man was still drinking, and I can reasonably figure that the reason he was approached in the first place was because of who his brother was. I can also attest beyond a doubt that the effect the Libya thing had on my sister, my mother, my sisters, my brother and me rivaled, even far surpassed, any stunt he'd pulled before. And though alcohol was a true culprit, the Libya thing was probably the last push that ended with the old man hitting bottom. He learned very quickly there was a big difference between running the family peanut business and stepping up to bat in the world of international trade. Ideally, the Libya thing would have begun in a smoky bar down around the equator somewhere. There'd be slow-turning ceiling fans and palms, and over in the corner in a rattan chair, a fat man wearing a fez. All the players would be well-dressed in either leather jackets or linen suits, and every spoken word would be a work of art. And then the obvious villain would appear, sidling through the door. He'd approach the hero, who sat coolly at the brass-railed mahogany bar, staring pensively into the mirror behind it. The villain would then mesmerize the hero with whispers of great riches, if only, if only. But it would all end there, with the hero having seriously considered the proposal, then of course discarding it. Though the hero is down on his luck, as low as he's ever been, he knows to join in would only take him lower. What a story. But it didn't happen that way. To eventually become something that we would live with full-time for almost 3 years, the beginning of the Libya deal was hardly something to sit up and take notice of. The old man was approached in July 1978 by a state senator from Georgia and a couple of other people. They met with him at the station and asked him if he would go to Libya as part of a goodwill trip organized by the Libyan government to help promote trade between two countries. After first declining, my dad agreed. He was tired, he said, and thought a change would be good for him. So that's how it all began. Seemed pretty innocent at first, but became a monster. One of the most amazing things, well, he eventually survived the Libyan deal. Of course, everything was dropped, but he was investigated by the IRS. That was dropped. All these investigations were dropped within 2 weeks after the 1980 election, and we were told none of this was political. We found out differently. He survived all of that, but the most remarkable thing about him surviving all of this, that during this time period when the whole world seemed to be falling on his head, he went into treatment for 9 weeks and became sober. We were all proud of him for that. Later on, in the mid-'80s, he started a new career in the mobile home business, still sober, stayed sober till the day he died. And things started picking up for him a little bit. It seemed for a while there nobody would touch him. You know, all of his personal appearances had been dropped. He couldn't get anything. Of course, he had been the celebrity for a while. He was gone from the family business. The family business had been sold by this time, as a matter of fact. So he had nothing to do, and he went into the mobile home business and did very well. But just as soon as things started looking very good for him, he was getting a few calls to do commercials. He was approached to do a book. As happens often in real life, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and of course he died in 1988. I still go back to planes. I live up here in Tennessee. But I still go back to Plains because part of me is there. My father's there. My family's there. Plains will always be part of me. It is August, and we're going home for a few days. 2 or 3 times a year, my wife and I and our 2 sons travel the 320 miles south from Tennessee, where we live, home to Plains. We all have different reasons for calling that small town home. I was born and raised there. And though I know I really don't, I think I own it. My wife, who was brought up in large cities and suburbs, found out there really were a few places seemingly untouched by the rest of the world in the short years she lived there, and became enchanted. And though I think they don't yet know it, my sons are drawn there, tugged a bit by the red dirt running through their veins. We leave the interstate just south of Birmingham and ease onto the familiar stretch of Highway 280 East. And though still 170 miles away, I feel as if we were almost there, because on this highway there are no more twists and turns, no more interstate exits, and this highway will lead us right to Mama's front yard. Overpasses and out-of-state tags give way to slow-moving pickup trucks and well-tended fields, and we become excited at the glimpses of signs and scenes that mark the progress of our trip. 4-acre flea markets, a billboard with a painted picture of Satan that reads, "Go to church or the devil will get you." Red earth, pecan trees, vast carpets of kudzu, and portable signs selling $2 watermelons and neck bones by the pound. My sons become antsy and ask over and over again, when are we going to get there? They believe there is something mystical about their southern cousins, though they will lose their shine in a few days. And they both want to see what their grandmama in Georgia has stocked the cupboard with. They are only 2 of 11 grandchildren, each the favorite. Before we were married, my wife had no sisters, and mine adopted her. Now she has 4 or 5, really, because my mother adopted her too. I think she is eager again to talk the talk of sisters, but more than that, I think she wants to make sure the town where dressed-up little old ladies bring pies to your home and where the postmaster gives you chewing gum is still there. I want to sit at the kitchen table, drink coffee with Mama, and talk about how things used to be. I want to see my sisters and my brother. I want to drive the dirt roads I know better than I know my name. And I want to talk to my dad. Then we arrive, and Mama is out the front door before we come to a stop. She has been waiting and watching, and I'm sure she sensed us some 30 miles away as only mamas can. Everybody hugs. Then my mother inspects my wife, asks her how she feels, and tells her she looks so good. My sons, quiet for the first time in 200 years, have huge grins on their faces. They both act shy and duck their heads when Mama grabs them and says, "You better give me some sugar." They give her some sugar. We go inside, and it is home. Mama says everybody will be over for supper. It seems our arrival is an event. After we've rested a bit and settled in, I tell them I'll be back in a while. My sons want to come with me, but my wife tells them to stay here. Daddy will be back soon. She knows where I'm going. I make a quick trip to the store and buy a single beer, hoping I won't see anyone I know just yet. There is ritual to visiting. 1 mile west of town on an old familiar road, I park and sit for a moment, waiting for something, I guess. When it doesn't come, I get out and walk the path to my father's grave. There are other stones here etched with my family name, but I pass those by. There will be other visitors. Then I stand in front of, looking down at, my dad's marker. I pop the top and raise the beer, and with a cheer I don't really feel, I say, "What's up, old man?" And as always, I calculate the months and years represented by blank granite between the dates of birth and death. He was young. I sit on the ground, careful of the sand spurs and red ants, and sip my beer. And I tell him about Marlene and about my sons. I talk about my writing and my job. I tell him Mama is okay, though she misses him. And I tell him Earl is fine and bigger than me now, but that I can still kick his ass. And then I tell him he was right about so many things and give belated thanks for past unsolicited advice. It is not right he should be so much easier to talk to dead than alive. I notice fresh flowers by the headstone and remember how he started planting bulbs and trees and flowers after he got sick. Before, he'd never taken any interest in plants other than crops. It is sad to think it was in the few months before he died he discovered the glory of growth. Or maybe not. Maybe he found comfort in this discovery and surrendered easily, knowing his roots abound through us and ours and always would. I hope so. Before I go, I reach in my pocket, pull out a new penny, and place it heads up on the marker. Part of the ritual. There should be others, proof of past visits, but they are gone now. I can't help wondering if those vanished bits of copper fill the kitty in some celestial poker game played with my grandmother. I raise my beer again and say, "Take care, old man." Then I drive towards home. It is supper time. Thank you.
About 10 minutes for questions.
Okay.
And for the benefit of our C-SPAN audience, I would ask that anyone who has a question either approach this microphone to ask it, or if you would prefer to ask from your seat, buddy, if you would just simply repeat the question before answering it.
Okay. Yes, sir.
It seems like your father and your uncle are so tremendously different, especially in their lifestyle. I'd like to know how they got along with each other.
Well, in the beginning, you have to understand, Jimmy was 14 years older than my father. And by the time my father was old enough to know what was going on around him, my uncle left, gone to college. So when my uncle came back from the Navy after my grandfather died, my father did not like him one damn bit. I mean, this was a strange guy coming in and trying to take over his world. But eventually, they fought a lot, fist fought a lot. But eventually, he came to understand that they were different, and they just lived with it. My uncle will tell you to this day, my father was one of the best workers he ever saw in his life, and that was true. But they got along very well. They loved each other. You could tell towards the end there with my father. My uncle was there most of the time with my dad, but they really loved each other, got along well. Anybody? Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
William Buddy Carter is the son of Billy Carter. He wrote a previous book titled The Search for Savin' Sam. Longstreet Press publishes this biography of his father.